In the middle of a frozen winter in a small mountain town, a blind former police officer walked into a canine rehabilitation center looking for a guide dog and found something no one expected. A dangerous retired German shepherd that everyone feared and no one could touch. They said the dog was broken, aggressive, untrainable, and should never be adopted. But when the blind man stopped outside the kennel, the dog did something that shocked the entire building. That moment changed two lives forever. This is a story about loss, courage, and the kind of connection that only appears when everything else is gone. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from and leave your city or country in the comments, because these stories travel farther than we imagine. Stay with me, because what happened next will restore your faith and hope. Begins in Briar Ridge, Montana, where winter does not simply arrive. It takes the town by the collar and holds it still. Snow falls in slow, deliberate sheets, thick as feathers, soft as ash, turning streetlights into pale halos and storefront windows into quiet lanterns. The mountains beyond the ridge sit like old gods, broad-shouldered and unmoved, their tree lines swallowed by white. On a morning like this, sound travels differently. Every footstep is muffled, every breath becomes a small ghost. That is why the tapping of a white cane can feel like a drumbeat. Caleb Rowan stepped off a county shuttle and onto the salted curb as if he were stepping onto a new planet. He was 41, tall in the way men become when they've learned to hold themselves upright through pain, with a frame that suggested he used to be broader before grief sanded him down. His hair, dark brown touched with early winter at the temples, was trimmed close, practical, the kind of haircut that doesn't ask questions. A faint scar traced from the edge of his right eyebrow toward his hairline, thin and pale, like a crack in porcelain. His eyes were open but unfocused, a cloudy gray-blue that didn't quite land on anything, and yet his face carried the alertness of someone who listened the way other people looked. Caleb's expression, even when calm, held a quiet tension, as if his jaw had been trained to brace for impact. He wore a heavy charcoal coat with a raised collar, a wool scarf tucked neatly, and gloves that had seen better winters. A service harness was slung over one shoulder, brand new, still stiff with possibility. And in his right hand the cane moved in smooth, practiced arcs. Tap, sweep, tap, mapping the world in front of him inch by inch. The blindness had been with him 3 years, long enough to become routine, not long enough to become peace. In Briar Ridge, people still spoke of the blast, the way they spoke of blizzards and funerals, as if naming it might keep it from happening again. Caleb had been a patrol officer here, the dependable kind, the one who showed up early and stayed late, who remembered kids' names and held doors for strangers without thinking. Then a rescue call went wrong. A confined space. A flash. Heat like a furious sun. He woke into darkness and found that his life had been rearranged without his permission. Losing sight was only the obvious part. The deeper loss was subtler, the way silence moved into his house and began to sit at his table like an uninvited guest. Since then, he had been living in a smaller world, measured, careful, polite, like a man walking on ice that might crack at any moment. Today, he came to Northwind Canine Haven, a rehabilitation and adoption center for retired working dogs, because the quiet had grown teeth. The building rose from the whiteness like a sturdy ship in a frozen sea, low, wide, practical, with a pitched roof burdened by snow. Warm air and disinfectant met him at the door, along with a faint, living smell beneath the cleanliness. Metal, wet fur, kibble, and the sharp sweetness of straw. Somewhere deeper inside, dogs barked in a chorus that was neither friendly nor hostile, just alive. The receptionist's desk was near the entrance, and behind it stood a woman who moved with the efficient gentleness of someone who had learned that fear can be soothed, but never rushed. Her name was Elise Hartman. Elise was in her late 30s, average height, with a sturdy, capable build that suggested she could lift a 60-pound dog without drama and carry it like a sack of flour if she had to. Her blonde hair was tied back in a loose bun that would fall apart by noon, and she wore a mustard-colored sweater beneath a facility vest, sleeves pushed up as if the day were always too busy for formality. Freckles dusted her cheeks, and there were faint crescents under her eyes, proof of long shifts and too much caring. Elise's voice was warm but steady, the kind that doesn't flinch when something growls. She greeted Caleb by name as if she had been expecting him all winter. "Mr. Rowan?" "Caleb?" she asked, stepping around the desk, careful not to startle him, letting him hear her approach. "I'm Elise. I'm going to walk you through today's visit." Her tone held a practiced compassion, not pity. If something had changed her, it was years of watching animals arrive in pieces and learning that tenderness must sometimes wear armor. Caleb smiled faintly, a small lift at one corner of his mouth. "Please," he said. "Just Caleb." Elise agreed without hesitation. She offered her elbow the way one might offer a handrail, quietly, without making the other person feel smaller. Caleb took it, fingers light, and they moved forward through the first corridor. The floor beneath his boots shifted from entry mat to polished concrete, and each change in texture told him where he was. His cane tapped the seams. He counted doors by sound and spacing. Elise described as they walked, not in a flood, but in clear, measured notes. "We have several dogs trained for service placement," she explained. "Some are retired K9s. Some were bred and trained specifically for guiding. We're careful about temperament matching." Caleb listened, but his mind was elsewhere, hovering over one sentence he had not yet spoken. He wasn't looking for perfect. Perfect was for people who still believed life played fair. He was looking for someone, or something, that understood what it meant to lose your purpose and still wake up breathing. The first wing was calm by kennel standards. He heard playful yips, nails clicking, tails thumping. When Elise opened a door, warm air rolled out along with the panting sound of an eager dog. A handler introduced a yellow Labrador, Cooper, 2 years old, gentle, trained, with a heart like an open field. The handler, Jonah Mills, was a young man in his mid-20s, lanky and energetic, with dark hair that refused to lie flat, and a kind of optimism that had not yet been tested by tragedy. Jonah spoke quickly and smiled often, the sort of person who believed problems had solutions if you cared enough. Caleb appreciated the dog's calm breathing, the soft nudge of a nose against his palm, the unguarded friendliness. He even chuckled once when Cooper tried to steal his glove. For a moment, the world loosened. But as they moved on, deeper into the facility, the acoustics changed. Sound began to bounce harder off steel and concrete. The air cooled. The smell sharpened, more metallic now, threaded with something older than disinfectant. A hint of stress, like sweat beneath a uniform. Caleb's cane tapped slower, and his shoulders lifted a fraction. Elise's voice softened, as if she too felt the shift. "This next corridor connects to our secured wing," she said. "Retired working dogs who need rehab, decompression, specialized care?" Caleb nodded, though his expression tightened. He had faced men with weapons in alley shadows. Yet walking into a place where grief wore fur and teeth felt strangely heavier. Halfway down the corridor, it happened. A sound split the air. Not a bark, not even a growl at first. It began as a low rumble, deep enough that Caleb felt it through the bones of his ribs, like thunder arguing with the earth. Then it rose, sharp, violent, and sudden. Metal clanged, something large slammed against bars, and a series of explosive barks followed, each one hitting the corridor like a fist. Elise stopped so fast Caleb nearly bumped her shoulder. Jonah swore under his breath and backed instinctively. From behind a closed door farther down, another staff member called out, "Hold the line," and boots moved quickly on concrete. Caleb did not step back. His chin lifted. He stood still as if his body had become a tuning fork. The barking continued, savage and relentless, but beneath it, Caleb heard the strangest detail. A hitch in the breath between barks, a frantic rhythm not of attack, but of panic. Elise's hand tightened around his arm with protective reflex. "We're going to turn back," she said, trying for calm. "That's one of our high-risk residents." Caleb's cane tip hovered above the floor. "High risk," he repeated, not as a question but as a careful taste of the words. Elise hesitated. Her silence was an answer. Jonah's earlier optimism drained into caution. "He's not part of adoption," Jonah added, voice lower. Not even close. The barking stopped abruptly, the way a storm sometimes pauses before the next strike. For one breath, the corridor held its own silence. Caleb felt the hairs on his arms lift beneath his coat. From behind the door, something moved. Heavy paws pacing, then stopping. The air seemed to tighten. And in that tightness, Caleb heard a sound that didn't belong to a monster. A long inhale, almost shaky, like someone gathering themselves so they wouldn't break in front of witnesses. Elise tried again, firmer. Caleb, will focus on dogs trained for guiding. The ones ready. The ones safe. Caleb's fingers curled around the cane handle, not from fear, but from a pull he could not explain. He had lived with men who came home from war and turned into strangers, with friends who laughed too loud because silence hurt, with nights where his own chest felt like a locked room. That door down the corridor, whatever lived behind it, did not sound like simple aggression. It sounded like a heart clawing at a cage. Caleb turned his face toward the barking's origin, eyes empty of sight but not of certainty. His voice came out quiet, almost respectful, the way one might speak near a grave. "That isn't anger," he said. "That's pain." Elise drew a slow breath, as if she had just heard a dangerous truth spoken aloud. Somewhere behind the door, the pacing resumed. 1, 2, 3 steps, then stopped again, listening. And Caleb, standing in the snow-cooled hallway of Northwind K9 Haven, felt the unmistakable sensation of being noticed by something that had forgotten how to trust. The winter outside pressed its white palms against the windows, watching like a silent god, while inside, a broken man and an unseen dog stood on opposite sides of a corridor that suddenly felt like destiny. The door at the end of the corridor did not open. It did not need to. Everything about the presence behind it was already written in the air. The metallic tang of tension, the vibration of something large and restless, pacing in a space too small for the weight of its memory, the faint echo of a life that once ran on purpose and now ran on pain. Caleb stood where he was, the white cane hovering above the seam in the concrete floor, as if the building itself had drawn a line and dared him to cross it. Elise's hand remained on his arm, steady but uncertain, and Jonah had shifted his stance, the optimism he carried like a coat, now folded somewhere behind his ribs. The barking resumed, not the earlier thunder, but a lower, ragged sound that scraped the corridor and then fell away into a heavy, uneven breathing. "We'll take a different route," Elise said carefully, as if moving a piece on a board she did not control. "That wing is not part of the visit." Caleb did not argue. He did not need to. His body was listening to something older than policy. As Elise guided him back toward the brighter wing, he asked, "How old is he?" The question surprised her. "The dog," he added, and she understood. "About 7, she said. "Prime years for a working shepherd." "What happened to him?" Jonah answered before Elise could. "His handler was killed on duty. Winter before last. Warehouse raid outside Alder Creek. They were a top team." Jonah was young, but he had learned how to speak of death without breaking. "The dog's name is Draven." The name landed in Caleb's chest with a soft, dull thud, as if it had always been waiting there. Elise inhaled, then continued the story in the careful way people do when they are telling it to themselves as much as to anyone else. "Officer Matthew Hale," she said. "Mid-30s, married, 1 little girl. He and Draven had been together 4 years. They were inseparable." The corridor opened into a warmer space where light filtered through high windows, turning the snow outside into a silver veil. They paused near a small office, where an older man sat hunched over paperwork, his back bowed by years of lifting and letting go. This was Raymond Pike, the facility's director of rehabilitation, early 60s, heavy-set, with a graying beard and hands that always smelled faintly of dog shampoo and coffee. Raymond had once been a K9 handler himself, long before bureaucracy replaced adrenaline. He looked up when he heard Elise's voice. "Ray, this is Caleb Rowan," she said. "He's here to evaluate for service placement." Raymond stood, offering his hand, his grip firm, respectful. "Welcome," he said. His voice had the gravel of winter roads. "You picked a good day to come inside." Caleb smiled, shook his hand, and felt the unspoken in the pause that followed. I heard a dog, Caleb said, not accusing, just stating a fact of the world. Raymond's jaw tightened a notch. Draven, he said, because there was no sense pretending. He's complicated. The office smelled of paper and peppermint, a small heater humming near the wall. Raymond gestured for them to sit. Caleb remained standing, cane tucked lightly under his arm, as if sitting would make the story heavier. Tell me, Caleb said. Raymond did. He spoke of the night in question, the kind of night that never really ends. Snow had been falling then, too, a slow, treacherous drift that swallowed sound and turned the world into a trap. The call came in near dusk. Armed suspect, warehouse near the creek, reports of children inside. Matthew and Draven were first on scene. They breached together. Inside, the air was thick with dust and old oil. A flashbang went off wrong. The suspect fired. In the chaos, Matthew went down. Draven did what he was trained to do. He neutralized the threat, then returned to his partner. When backup arrived, they found Draven pressed against Matthew's chest, muzzle nudging his face, a low sound vibrating through the concrete like a prayer that refused to end. They tried to pull him away. He snapped, not in rage, but in refusal. Since then, Draven had not been the same. He attacked two handlers who entered his space too quickly. He tore apart an evaluation room. He refused sedation. He refused food from anyone but Elise, and even then only sometimes. We keep him in the secured wing, Raymond said, voice tired but loyal. He saved lives. He earned the right to live out his days, even if they're hard. Caleb listened without moving, his face open in the way people become when they recognize a mirror. Grief, he said softly, as if testing the shape of the word. Elise nodded. Jonah looked down at his shoes. Outside the window, the wind worried the snow into small storms. The barking did not return, but the memory of it hovered like a shadow behind the conversation. I'm not here to adopt him, Caleb said, because the room needed to hear that. I came for a guide dog, but I don't believe he's a monster. Raymond studied him, eyes narrowing with the instinct of a man who has seen hope get people hurt. Belief doesn't change teeth, he said, or strength. Caleb inclined his head. No, but it changes what you do with them. There was a pause, the kind that decides futures. Finally, Raymond exhaled. You can stand in the corridor again, he said, at a distance, with staff present. Elise squeezed Caleb's arm, a silent promise. They returned to the hallway, the air cooler, the sound sharper. The door to the secured wing remained closed. Caleb took his place 10 steps away, as before. He lifted his chin and waited. At first, nothing. Then a low, tentative rumble, as if the earth were clearing its throat. Draven's breathing came through the crack beneath the door, heavy, uneven, alive. Caleb spoke, not loud, not commanding. My name is Caleb. He felt foolish. Then steady. I lost someone too. The rumble faltered. Pause paced once, twice, then stopped. The air changed, tightening, listening. Caleb's hand drifted to the pocket of his coat where a folded scrap of fabric lived, the last piece of a ballistic vest that had been torn away in the blast that took his sight and his partner. He did not take it out. He did not need to. The memory of it was enough. From behind the door came a sound that was not bark, not growl, a soft, broken whine that did not belong to a dangerous animal, but to a heart that had forgotten how to hold itself together. Elise's breath caught. Jonah's eyes widened. Raymond said nothing. The whine faded into a long exhale. Then silence. Not the absence of noise, but the presence of attention. Caleb lowered his hand, the moment sealed between him and the unseen. He did not step closer. He did not ask for more. He had learned after the blast that some doors only open when you are willing to wait outside them. That's enough for today, Raymond said, gently but firm. You've given him something. Elise guided Caleb back toward the brighter wing. As they walked, Caleb's shoulders loosened a fraction, as if the quiet in his house had found a new place to rest. At the exit, snow had thickened, the town a white hush. Elise wrapped his scarf tighter against the wind. "We'll schedule another visit," she said, "with the dogs trained for guiding." Caleb nodded, but his mind was already counting the steps of a corridor he could not see. He paused at the door, turning his face back toward the secured wing, toward a presence that had answered him without a word. Outside, winter kept its patient watch over Briar Ridge, and somewhere behind steel and memory, a German shepherd named Draven stood still, listening to the echo of a man who had spoken to him as if he were not beyond saving. Snow did not stop falling over Briar Ridge. It drifted from the sky in wide, unhurried spirals, settling into the quiet corners of the town as though the world itself were tucking something wounded in for the night. By the time Caleb returned to Northwind K9 Haven 3 days later, the sidewalks were buried beneath a pale hush, and the mountains beyond the ridge stood like silent witnesses, their dark lines softened by white. Caleb stepped from the shuttle, his breath ghosting the air, the familiar ache in his chest steady but manageable. He had not slept much since the last visit. Not because of the barking, but because of the silence that had followed it. The kind of silence that presses on you, asking if you are brave enough to answer what it suggests. He entered the building with the memory of the corridor mapped in his mind. Counting steps, feeling the change in temperature and sound as Elise met him near the desk. Elise Hartman looked tired but alert, her blonde hair pulled back in the same half-done knot, freckles standing out against the winter paleness of her cheeks. "You came back," she said, not quite a question, her voice holding something that sounded like relief. Caleb nodded, a faint smile on his mouth. "I told you I would." She guided him through the first wing again, where the gentler dogs waited, their tails thumping and nails clicking. A border collie named Lila, 3 years old, small and quick with bright, clever eyes, sniffed his gloves and sneezed. A golden retriever, Harold, 8 years old and dignified, pressed his warm body against Caleb's leg and sighed. Caleb appreciated them all. He truly did. But his attention kept drifting, tugged by an invisible thread, back toward the place where the air grew colder and the walls remembered something heavier. Elise noticed. "Raymond approved another corridor visit," she said quietly. "Same distance, staff present." Caleb's shoulders eased. They moved toward the secured wing. The corridor felt narrower today, or perhaps he was more aware of it. The building hummed softly with life, pipes ticking, a heater coughing, a radio murmuring somewhere behind a door. When they reached the place where the door to the secured wing closed off the world, Caleb stopped where he had before, 10 steps back, the cane angled across his body like a boundary he had chosen rather than one imposed. Jonah stood nearby, his lanky frame wrapped in a thick jacket, dark hair flattened by a knit cap. Raymond lingered farther down the hall, arms folded, the weight of responsibility carved into his stance. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Draven's presence made itself known, not in thunder this time, but in the steady, restless pacing of a creature too large for the cage of his memory. Caleb lifted his chin, the corridor quieting around him. "It's me," he said, and felt the strangeness of speaking into a door. "Caleb?" The pacing slowed. The air seemed to lean closer. Caleb took a breath that tasted of winter and antiseptic. "I won't come any nearer," he continued. "I just wanted you to know I'm here." From behind the door came the faintest sound, a long inhale that trembled at the end. Elise's hand rose to her mouth. Jonah's eyes flicked to Raymond, then back to the door. The moment held. Caleb did not fill it with more words. He had learned that sometimes the bravest thing was to let quiet do the work. Minutes passed. The heater clicked. Snow whispered against the windows. Draven's breathing grew steadier, slower, like a tide that had found its rhythm again. Then, unexpectedly, a soft sound slipped through the crack beneath the door. A low, broken whine, barely more than a thread of voice, but unmistakable. Caleb's chest tightened. He did not reach for the scrap of vest in his pocket this time. He did not need the talisman. He recognized the sound. He had made it himself once, on a hospital bed at 3 in the morning, when the pain of what was gone pressed so hard that language could not hold it. I know, Caleb said, his voice careful, almost tender. I know what that feels like. The whine faded, replaced by a long exhale. Pause shifted once, then went still. Draven was listening. Raymond cleared his throat softly, a man watching something he had been told was impossible. That's all we can do today, he murmured. Caleb nodded. As Elise guided him back, Caleb felt the faintest warmth under his ribs, the kind that does not erase cold but teaches you how to endure it. Outside, the snow thickened. The town moved on in muffled ways. Over the next week, the visits continued. Always the same distance. Always the same rules. But the same door no longer felt like a wall. Draven's reactions changed in small, meaningful ways. The thunder never returned. The pacing grew less frantic. The breathing, once jagged, began to slow. Sometimes the whine came, soft and short, like a question that did not yet know its answer. Sometimes there was only the shared quiet of two beings standing on opposite sides of a barrier that was learning how to be thin. Caleb spoke little. When he did, it was of ordinary things. The weather, the way the snow sounded on the roof of his porch, the memory of coffee in a chipped mug on a Sunday morning. He did not speak of the blast, or of the man he had lost, or of the night that had rearranged him. He did not need to. Draven already knew. On the 9th day, something shifted. Caleb arrived later than usual, his steps slower, his jaw tight with an old ache that winter had woken. Elise guided him to the corridor, her eyes searching his face. "Rough day?" she asked. Caleb nodded once. He stood in his place, lifted his chin, and said nothing. The door answered him with a single, uncertain whine, then another. Caleb's hand rose, hovering near his chest. He took the scrap of fabric from his pocket, the torn edge of a ballistic vest stiff with age and memory, and held it in his palm, though he did not yet extend it. "I lost him too," he said, the words landing in the corridor like snowflakes, each one distinct. "My partner. Winter night. I woke up in the dark. I thought the world had ended." From behind the door came a sharp inhale, then the sound of paws stepping closer. The air tightened, electric with attention. Caleb's breath shook once, then steadied. "It didn't," he said, "but it changed." He lowered himself slowly to one knee, the movement deliberate, so no one would mistake it for threat. He extended his hand, the scrap of fabric resting on his open palm, stopping inches from the floor, still far from the door. The hallway held its breath. Elise's fingers dug into her sleeve, Jonah's shoulders tensed. Raymond did not move. There was a long moment of nothing. Then Draven's breathing grew faster, more urgent, as if he had begun to smell a storm long before it arrived. A low sound rose in his chest. Not a growl, not a bark. Something torn and old. Paws scuffed. The whine returned, stronger now, the sound of a heart cracking its own shell. Caleb did not move his hand. He did not look toward the door. He simply remained, an offering made of patience and memory. When the sound finally faded, replaced by the steady rhythm of breath, Caleb rose slowly and withdrew his hand. "That's enough for today," he said, echoing Raymond's words from the week before. They left the corridor as they always did, but the space between the door and Caleb felt different now, charged with something that had not been there before. Recognition. That night, in his small house at the edge of Briar Ridge, Caleb sat in the dark and listened to the snow build its quiet empire on the world. He thought of a German shepherd named Draven standing in a cage of steel and memory, and of the way two broken things had begun, without touching, to lean toward each other. The storm arrived without ceremony. The kind of winter fury that did not announce itself with thunder, but with silence so deep it felt like the world had stopped breathing. By dusk, Briar Ridge was buried beneath drifting walls of snow. Wind clawed at rooftops and bent the trees along Alder Creek until their branches groaned like old men remembering too much. Northwind K9. Haven stood in the middle of it all, a low building of steel and concrete, its windows glowing against the white void like the eyes of something stubbornly alive. Caleb had been inside the facility for nearly an hour when the first flicker of trouble appeared. He stood in the secured corridor again, 10 steps from Draven's door, Elise beside him, Jonah at the far end near the supply room, and Raymond pacing behind them like a general guarding a battlefield he could not leave. The building hummed with heaters and distant barking. Snow rattled the windows. Caleb was speaking softly, telling Draven about the way the river froze each winter and how the ice cracked like laughter under a careless boot. Then the smell changed. It was subtle at first, a thin thread of bitterness that did not belong to winter or disinfectant. Elise was the first to notice. Her shoulders stiffened. "Do you smell that?" she asked. Jonah sniffed. "Electrical, like burning plastic." Raymond swore under his breath and turned toward the maintenance wing. Before he could take 3 steps, the lights flickered. Once, twice, then they steadied, casting long shadows across the corridor. A radio crackled somewhere in the building. Static. A voice half lost in snow. "Control to all staff. We've got smoke in Wing C, possible short. Fire team en route." The words barely finished echoing before the alarm erupted. A shrill scream tore through the building, red lights flashing against the concrete walls, turning the corridor into a wound that would not close. Dogs began barking, a rising storm of sound, fear passing from cage to cage like electricity. Elise's hand flew to Caleb's arm. "We have to move," she said, already guiding him toward the exit. Jonah sprinted past them, shouting instructions. Raymond barked orders into his radio, his voice hoarse but controlled. Caleb did not resist at first. He followed Elise's pull, cane tapping faster now, counting steps, heart punching his ribs. Smoke drifted from the far end of the hall, a gray ribbon curling under the ceiling, carrying the taste of ash. Then, through the chaos, he heard it. Draven. Not the measured breathing of the last visits. Not the low whine of recognition. This was panic. A raw, frantic barking burst from behind the secured door, punctuated by the violent clang of a body slamming against steel. The sound tore through Caleb's chest and lodged there. Elise felt him freeze. "Caleb," she said, urgent. "We have to go, now." He turned his face toward the sound, eyes empty of sight but burning with something else. "He's still in there." Raymond reached them, smoke already streaking his beard. "All dogs in the secured wing are locked down. The fire doors." Another explosion of sound from Draven's kennel, metal shrieking as he hurled himself against the bars. A long, desperate howl followed, a sound that did not belong to a dangerous animal but to something being abandoned for the second time in its life. Caleb stopped walking. "I'm not leaving him," he said. Elise shook her head, panic rising. "You can't even see the smoke, Caleb. The corridor's filling. We have to get you out." "I know the way," he said quietly. Jonah ran back, coughing, eyes wide. "The north end's compromised. We're evacuating everything we can. The fire doors to the secured wing are jammed. We can't get to him." The words landed like a verdict. Caleb felt the world tilt. Draven slammed into the door again, the sound of it echoing through the building like a heartbeat gone wrong. Raymond's voice softened, the tone of a man choosing between 2 disasters. "Caleb, I'm sorry. We don't have the time." Caleb stepped out of Elise's grip. Snow and ash and fear filled his lungs. The alarm howled. The dog's barking rose into a single, living scream. He turned away from the exit. "Draven," he called into the smoke. The response came instantly, a bark cutting through the chaos, sharp and frantic but unmistakably aimed at him. Elise shouted his name. Jonah lunged for him, but Caleb slipped past with a speed born of something more than panic. He ran into the gray cane tapping wildly, shoulder-scraping concrete as he followed the map of the building burned into his memory from weeks of careful visits. Heat brushed his face. Smoke thickened, stinging his eyes though they could see nothing. His lungs burned. He coughed, staggered, kept going. "Draven!" he shouted. Another bark answered, closer now. The world had shrunk to sound and pain and memory. He counted the turns. Left at the supply room, 20 steps. Right. The air grew hotter. He felt the wall with his free hand, the vibration of something massive on the other side of it. I'm here, he said hoarsely. I'm right here. Draven's body slammed into the kennel door, the impact rattling the metal frame. His claws scraped frantically against the steel. The barking broke into whines between each breath, terror and hope tangled together. Caleb found the latch. The handle was blistering hot. He tore off his coat, wrapped it around his hand and pulled. It did not budge. Smoke poured into his mouth. His chest convulsed. He pulled again. Nothing. Do it again, he whispered to the dog on the other side of the door. Hit it again. Draven hurled himself forward with everything he had. The weakened lock snapped. The kennel door burst open. Draven exploded into the corridor, a black and tan missile of muscle and smoke. He crashed into Caleb, knocking him backward, then immediately circled him, whining, licking his face, pressing his body against Caleb's chest as if counting the pieces to make sure they were all still there. Caleb coughed, hands sinking into the thick fur at Draven's neck. Good boy, he rasped. Good boy. A beam collapsed somewhere behind them, the crash deafening. Heat surged. Flames licked along the ceiling, racing toward them. Draven barked once, sharp and commanding, then turned and pressed his shoulder against Caleb's leg. The message was clear. This way. Caleb let the dog take his weight. Step by step, Draven guided him through the burning wing, steering him around fallen debris, pausing before gaps in the floor. Choosing the only path that still breathed. Caleb could not see the fire, but he could feel Draven, the steady push of his body, the pull of his teeth on Caleb's sleeve, the rhythm of his breathing, fast but controlled. The once feared K9 had become his eyes. They burst through the fire doors as the roof behind them gave way in a roar of sparks. Cold air hit Caleb's face like a blessing. Snow swirled. Firefighters grabbed him. Voices shouted. Sirens wailed. Draven did not leave his side. He stood over Caleb, chest heaving, tail low, ears pinned back, his body a shield against every approaching hand. Elise dropped to her knees beside them, sobbing, smoke streaking her face. You're alive, she whispered. Thank God. Caleb reached up, touching Draven's head. The dog leaned into the contact, trembling but unbroken. In the middle of the storm, in the middle of fire and snow, something impossible had happened. A dangerous dog had saved a blind man, and neither of them would ever be the same. Morning came reluctantly to Briar Ridge. Smoke still clung to the valley, thin gray ribbons floating above the snow like ghosts that had forgotten where to go. The remains of the north wing of Northwind K9 Haven steamed in the cold, blackened beams jutting upward through drifts of white. Fire trucks stood in silent rows, their ladders lowered, their crews exhausted. The storm had eased, but winter's breath remained heavy over everything that lived. Caleb lay on a stretcher near the perimeter, an oxygen mask pressed to his face, his chest rising and falling in shallow, aching pulls. His throat burned. His hands shook from cold and smoke and the sheer violence of what his body had just survived. But even now, he kept one hand buried in thick fur. Draven would not leave him. The German shepherd stood pressed against the side of the stretcher, his massive head hovering near Caleb's shoulder, eyes scanning every approaching shape with raw intensity. His black and tan coat was streaked with ash, his whiskers frosted with melted snow. His legs trembled from exhaustion and smoke exposure, yet his posture remained unyielding, a wall of muscle and devotion between Caleb and the rest of the world. A paramedic tried to step closer. Draven growled, not in fury, in fear. Caleb lifted his hand weakly, touching the dog's neck. It's okay, boy, he whispered. They're helping. Draven hesitated, the growl fading into a low, uncertain rumble. He lowered his head and nudged Caleb's arm, as if reminding himself the man was still there. Elise arrived moments later, coat thrown over her uniform. Cheeks streaked with soot and tears. She dropped to her knees beside the stretcher. Caleb? I thought... She couldn't finish. I'm here, Caleb said softly. So is he. Her eyes moved to Draven. The dog met her gaze without hostility, only exhaustion and something like pleading. Elise pressed a hand to her mouth. Raymond Pike approached next, boots crunching in the snow. His broad shoulders looked smaller in the pale light. He stopped a few steps away, watching the scene unfold as if it defied everything he had believed. "Son," he said carefully, "what you did in there." Caleb turned his head toward him, blind eyes steady. "He saved my life." Raymond swallowed. Behind them, the crowd parted as director William Hargreaves pushed through. He was tall, sharply dressed even in the chaos, his silver hair immaculate, his eyes cold with authority. Hargreaves had not come to the center from the world of dogs. He came from the world of paperwork, liability, and lines that could not be crossed. "What is this?" Hargreaves demanded. "Why is a civilian on medical equipment inside a disaster zone? And why is that animal unrestrained?" Draven's ears flattened. His body shifted closer to Caleb's legs. Raymond stepped forward. "Sir, that animal just pulled him out of the burning wing." Hargreaves scoffed. "That dog has attacked staff. He is not safe." Draven let out a deep, vibrating warning. Caleb lifted his hand. "He wasn't attacking," he said. "He was protecting." Hargreaves looked down at the trembling, soot-covered German shepherd guarding the stretcher. For a moment, uncertainty flickered across his face. Then it hardened. "Get the man into the ambulance. Remove the dog." Two handlers approached cautiously. Draven reacted instantly. He planted himself between Caleb and the advancing men, teeth bared, chest heaving, a low growl rolling from his throat like thunder behind mountains. The handlers froze. Elise stepped forward. "Sir, please. He's terrified of losing him. He's not dangerous. He's grieving." Hargreaves ignored her. "Tranquilizer team on standby." Caleb's breath hitched. "No, don't." Draven pressed himself against Caleb's legs, trembling, whining, his eyes wide with panic. The memory of Matthew Hale, of being torn away from the only human he had ever trusted, burned through him again. "I won't leave him," Caleb whispered. Raymond raised his voice. "Sir, look at the dog. He hasn't harmed anyone since the fire." He guided a blind man through falling debris. A firefighter nearby nodded. "I saw it. He was calculating every move." Another paramedic added, "That dog kept that man alive." Hargreaves hesitated. His world had rules, but the evidence in front of him did not fit any of them. "Remove the stretcher," he said finally, slowly. As the paramedics began rolling Caleb toward the ambulance, Draven followed, his body glued to the stretcher, whining in distress. When the wheels lifted over the threshold, Draven nearly climbed inside with him. "Easy, boy," Caleb whispered, reaching for his fur. "I'm not going anywhere." Draven did not believe him. Not yet. The ambulance doors closed. Draven remained outside, nose pressed against the metal, breathing hard, tail low, body shaking. Elise knelt beside him. "He's alive." "He's okay." Draven sat. Finally. Slowly. But his eyes never left the vehicle. Hours later, when the smoke had thinned and the ash settled, Raymond sat with Hargreaves in the temporary command office. "That dog can't stay in isolation," Raymond said. "You saw him." "He has a record," Hargreaves replied. "He has a heart." Silence filled the room. Outside, Draven lay curled near the ambulance, waiting. That evening, Caleb was discharged with oxygen and strict warnings. Elise drove him back to the center so he could retrieve his things. When he stepped out of the car, Draven surged forward, whining, pressing his head into Caleb's chest, as if confirming again that the world had not taken him. Caleb sank to his knees in the snow, arms wrapping around the massive dog. Draven melted into him, his trembling finally easing. "You didn't lose me," Caleb whispered, "and I won't lose you." Above them, winter clouds drifted, and for the first time since the explosion that had broken both of their lives, something inside Draven loosened. Not the pain, but the fear of being alone with it. Winter refused to leave Briar Ridge. March passed with the stubborn silence of a town holding its breath. Snow still layered the rooftops. Ice clung to the riverbanks. The north wing of Northwind K9 Haven remained sealed behind caution tape and charred beams, a wound that would take time to close. Yet inside the scarred town, something else was slowly, carefully being rebuilt. Caleb Rowan healed in ways that could not be measured by doctors. His lungs still burned on cold mornings. Smoke had left its mark. Some nights he woke gasping, the memory of falling beams and searing heat folding into his dreams. He kept the window cracked open no matter how cold it grew, as if fresh air could guard him from the ghosts of fire. And every morning before the frost had fully loosened its grip on the world, a familiar truck rolled up the narrow drive to his small rented house near Alder Creek. Draven was always inside. At first, Elise drove him. She would park carefully, always in the same place, and open the passenger door before even greeting Caleb. Draven stepped out slowly, deliberately, his massive black and tan frame still bearing the scars of smoke and exhaustion. His coat had regained its shine, but his eyes remained different now. Not wild, not empty. Searching. He refused a leash from the very beginning. Caleb never asked him to wear one. Instead, they stood together on the porch, winter wind brushing their faces, and Draven leaned his shoulder lightly against Caleb's leg, the way he had in the fire. The message never changed. I am here. They began with the mailbox. 20 steps down the path. 20 back. Caleb counted. Draven matched him, step for step, pausing when the ground grew slick, nudging when the snowbank rose too high. When Caleb hesitated, Draven waited. When Caleb stumbled, Draven braced him. They learned each other not through commands but through breath and rhythm and the quiet trust of repetition. Inside Northwind K9 Haven, the real work began. The board demanded structure, behavioral assessments, exposure therapy, safety reviews. Raymond Pike sat through hours of discussion defending what he had witnessed with his own eyes. Elise brought logs so detailed they bordered on devotion. Jonah spoke of Draven's transformation in the steady voice of a young man who had seen his first miracle and did not intend to waste it. Director Hargreaves listened without interrupting. Draven was introduced to controlled environments, loud noises, sudden movements, strange handlers. At first, his body tightened with old fear, the memory of loss rising in his chest. But Caleb was always there, not touching, not interfering, simply standing in the room. Draven learned again how to breathe. There were setbacks. One afternoon, a dropped metal tray sent him into a crouch, ears pinned, body rigid with remembered terror. Caleb spoke softly. Draven lifted his head. The fear loosened. Another day, a stranger reached too fast and Draven barked once, sharp and loud. The staff froze. Caleb stepped forward. Draven stopped. The change was not dramatic. It was steady. By late winter, Draven began wearing a harness, then a lightweight guidance bar. Then he practiced routes around town with Caleb, the sidewalk to the grocery store, the path along the frozen creek, the steps up to the town library. People noticed. At first they kept their distance. The whispers followed them down the street. That is the dangerous one. That is the dog from the fire. Caleb never corrected anyone. He simply walked. Children were the first to break the fear. A little girl in a red coat stopped in the park and asked if she could pet him. Draven looked to Caleb. Caleb nodded. The girl placed her mittened hand on his fur. Draven exhaled. The sound of it was a release that echoed through the frozen afternoon. By March, the board reached its decision. Hargreaves called them into the conference room. His voice had lost its edge. He looked older now. Tired. The liability remains, he said. But the evidence is undeniable. Draven is no longer classified as a risk. He is cleared for private adoption under supervision. No one spoke. Elise pressed both hands to her mouth. Raymond closed his eyes. Caleb stood very still as if afraid the world might shatter if he moved. Draven walked forward and pressed his forehead against Caleb's chest. 2 days later, the papers were signed. The gates of Northwind K9 Haven opened. Draven walked out beside Caleb. No leash, no cage, no command. Only winter wind and new life. The town did not cheer. There were no cameras. Only a handful of people watching two wounded souls step into the cold sunlight together. Spring arrived slowly. Snow finally melted along the riverbanks. Ice loosened its hold. Grass pushed through the last crusts of white. In April, the police department held a ceremony. Officers lined the courtyard. Flags moved in the breeze. The chief spoke of courage, resilience, and the bond between those who serve. Draven may be retired, he said, but heroes do not retire. The crowd stood. Caleb placed a hand on Draven's back. "Thank you," he whispered. Draven closed his eyes and leaned into him. For the first time since the explosion, since the fire, since the long winter of grief, the world felt possible. Not perfect, but possible. And that was enough. This story reminds us that sometimes God's greatest miracles do not arrive as thunder or lightning. They arrive as a wounded man and a broken dog finding each other in the cold of winter. When the world says something is lost, God often says wait and watch. Because healing does not come from what we can see, but from what we are willing to love. In our own lives, we all carry invisible scars: grief, fear, loneliness, disappointment. And many of us believe those wounds make us unworthy of hope. But this story tells us the opposite. It tells us that God still writes new beginnings, even in the ashes of our worst days. If you are walking through a difficult season today, remember, you're not forgotten. You're not broken beyond repair, and your miracle may already be closer than you think. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs encouragement. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from. And if you believe in hope, healing, and second chances, subscribe to this channel for more stories that restore faith. May God bless you and your family with peace, strength, and new beginnings. And if you receive this message of hope, please comment. Amen.